Friends, very good to have you join us. James, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. Yes,
I hope you're keeping well.
I'm keeping very well.
Good. And where are we in the lectionary?
We are on the Sunday next before Lent.
I just knew you'd love saying it like that.
I did enjoy saying that.
Fantastic. And there are four things we'd love people to do.
There are. We would love people to like the videos.
Do
If
click like.
just click like.
Yeah.
We'd love you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed to the channel
Yeah, I
already.
do. Yeah, there's a subscribe button down here somewhere down there.
We'd love you to share on the social media.
That would be super duper. And again, you can click the button and it gives you a link and you can just sort of paste that somewhere.
And we'd love you to comment. Some very interesting comments last week, actually.
There were, weren't there? Which is
Yes.
the most interesting.
Well, I thought the one from America was particularly interesting. So,
Hi, America.
hi, America, particularly exhorting us, which probably means you, to enunciate clearly.
What do you mean it probably means me? So rude.
Well, we were both accused of mumbling, but I don't know whether it was me or you. So I thought I'd get a preemptive strike in.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. We do recognize that we do have a very particular English accent. Each of us does.
We do. We both come from the same part of England, actually, don't we? So
we do. So to our American friends, we apologize if we mumble. And of course, when we get a bit excited and have a bit of banter, then we sort of, it all breaks up a bit, doesn't it? So,
it does. It does. But we'll do our best to speak clearly.
We will, to enunciate.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, enunciating clearly, James, where are we in the lectionary?
So in the lectionary, we're in this. It's the Sunday next before Lent, so it's always.
Sorry, you said that already. Yes.
It's the Transfiguration. So it's Mark in the year of Mark. It's Mark 9 and 2 to 9. So verses 2 to 9. So we are there in Caesarea Philippi.
Yes.
And we are just following the confession of Peter of Jesus as the Messiah and Jesus' words about going to be suffering and so on. And he's turning his face towards the cross. And so this is a key and pivotal moment. These two chapters are absolutely pivotal in Mark, really.
They are. They're the center point. And there's some, we've actually noticed before, haven't we, that in the first half of Mark, up to chapter 8, there are certain themes. There's a dynamism. We get this thing, immediately, straightway. And Jesus is doing this, doing that, and delivering things and teaching and dynamic. And then at this hinge point, from then onwards, there's quite a different feel. And you can actually see that in the vocabulary, Mark. The actual vocabulary changes, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And what happens particularly is that everything becomes much more conflictual. So and in fact, I mean, the story after this, when they come down from the mountain, is a story of spiritual conflict. That becomes the sort of dominant theme as we move closer to the cross. The way of Jesus versus the way of everybody else, as it were, and that's So
can I just notice, before we get into the detail of the text, a couple of things which I think are rather odd. One is around that lectionary choice and the fact that we're looking at the Transfiguration now, immediately before then going back to the beginning of Jesus's ministry and going into the desert and the sort of 40 days leading up to Easter, which is a bit odd. I mean, it's to do with the weird dynamic of the way that the lectionary year sort of folds these rather different events together. So we, on the one hand, we start Lent remembering Jesus' temptations in the desert, and then at the end of Lent, suddenly we're at the cross. So, and then after Easter in ordinary time, we go back into looking at the ministry of Jesus in between those two events, which is a bit strange, isn't it?
It is a bit strange. Of course, we have the Feast of Transfiguration sometime in August, usually, I think, isn't it? So it's a weird thing that we seem to. The lectionary feels that we need to encounter this story twice, and in very, very different contexts. Yeah.
The other thing which I think is curious about it is the selection, because you mentioned what's gone before, and in Mark's account, in verse 1, it's the transition between it, and it seems to me it's very difficult to read Mark 9, Mark 2. Well, in the lectionary, it's actually Mark 2, just 9. Mark 9, 2 to 9.
2 to 9, yeah.
Passage could be a bit longer,
yeah.
But it misses out verse 1.
It does, yeah.
And it seems to me that verse 1 provides that hinge point, the link between what we've just had before, the confession at Caesarea Philippi, and what we then see. And it becomes rather important because of the contrast between the two things. Jesus says to them, truly I tell you, which is unusual in Mark, isn't it, to have an amen saying?
It is.
Amen, I say to you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God has come with power. Now, there's lots of reasons why that's such a hugely significant verse,
Mm.
partly because Jesus has just been talking about his suffering and death. The Son of Man will be handed over. And then we have this revelation of who he is in the Transfiguration on the one hand. On the other hand, quite a few critical scholars take this verse and say, aha, here we have Jesus predicting his return from the Father in power
Ah.
and coming of the kingdom,
Mm.
the parousia, in the lifetime of the disciples, and it doesn't happen. And this is great disappointment, and the whole of the New Testament is all about how do we cope with this lack of Jesus' return.
But that's actually to ignore the language, isn't it? Because the language of Perusia is not here. The language here is of well, it's Urkamai, isn't it? It's the language of
Oh,
coming,
yeah, yeah,
and that language is all I think nearly always in the New Testament associated with the resurrection and the ascension and the coming of the Spirit.
yeah, exactly.
So it's that that's in view on the timeline, as it were, which
Yeah,
of course is within the lifetime of those who are standing there.
yeah. And folks, if you're unsure about that, do search on the blog for my article about what is Matthew 24 all about, because exactly the same thing applies there.
It does.
Where Jesus uses this Erchomai language, this coming of the Son of Man language, which is Daniel 7 language. And as you say there, James, it refers to that cluster of events around Jesus' resurrection, exaltation to the Father, and ascension. So he is on the throne.
Yeah.
And of course, the confession that Jesus is on the throne, Jesus is Lord, for Paul is the Christian confession, isn't it?
Yes,
He mentions that in Romans 10 and also in 1 Corinthians 12. No one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Spirit. So the outpouring of the Spirit after Pentecost is a thing that makes us recognize that Jesus is enthroned at the right hand of the Father. He's Lord of our lives. And that's an anticipation of his ultimate return when all will see that he is Lord, Philippians 2.
Yes, and it's interesting that this takes place, this confession by Peter, essentially, you are the Messiah, his equivalent to Jesus is Lord, is taking place in Caesarea Philippi, which in Hebrews the name is Banias, and it was a shrine to the god Pan, so it was a center of Roman pagan worship.
Yes.
And yet Peter is confessing Christ in this place, which is also a source of the Jordan River, I think, isn't it? There's the water comes out there. So you've got these sort of different symbols, as it were.
Yes.
And Peter is doing this in the toughest place, in a sense, but also in that place where the water of the Jordan flows to bring life to the promised land. So there's a really fascinating kind of context, I think, which is worth just pondering.
It's almost as if it's kind of an enacted metaphor for what it means to follow Jesus in a world that doesn't recognize him, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does feel a bit like that.
In the sense that on the one hand, we live in a world where there are lots of competing gods around us, and to actually confess Jesus as Lord is to make a distinctive stand on that. On the other hand, it's a world, a place where the offer of life in Jesus is constantly being made.
Yes. And the language, I think, is interesting as well. Jesus is described as the Son of Man here, and Mark is famous for his use of this phrase, isn't he? And we may have touched on that, I think, in previous videos. But we're very conscious, or I think one always needs to be conscious when one sees it, that he's drawing on that vision in Daniel 7, where that phrase is used to describe somebody who is victorious through suffering. And here you've got both of those themes coming together. He's talked about his suffering, and now we're just in this transition in verse 1 to seeing the power and the glory of Jesus, which is going to be made clear in the Transfiguration. So these two things are actually absolutely held together, aren't they, in the ministry of Jesus?
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting you mentioned that word power, because that is a word that's only used in Mark 9:1, and the parallels in Luke and Matthew actually use slightly different language. And that's just, I happen to have handy we've mentioned this before, my gospel parallel. This is Throckmorton. And we're not going to look into detail, but it was just really instructive to say again, just a reminder that when we read a synoptic passage, it's really worth looking at the parallel passages and what they say. And it's just interesting to look at the shape here and to notice that here are the three passages all about the Transfiguration. And I don't know if I can get it in focus. There we go.
Yes, that's good.
It's just interesting to see that here is Mark in the middle, which is the shorter of the accounts. And here you see on this side in Luke, you can see there's a whole extra section here, which Matthew doesn't include. And then here you get an extra section which Matthew includes, which Luke doesn't. Again, just a reminder that Luke and Matthew almost never agree over against Mark. One of them follows them in one place and one of them follows in another place. But also to notice that, and again, it's really fascinating just to read the passage through, And if you read it in a more literal English version, if you're not reading it in Greek, then again, you can see that you've got this double feature of synoptic parallels, which is on the one hand, you get agreement about what happened, but you also get distinctive vocabulary because each of the gospel writers is both writing in his own style, but also drawing out his own particular theological emphases. So, for example, I was very struck by the fact in Luke's account, it says he went up the mountain to pray. And of course, that's one of Luke's key features is Jesus' prayer life. And Matthew and Mark don't mention that.
No, no. And Mark, I mean, and that word power actually is interesting in the first one, isn't it? Because Mark is very interested in power, and I think he uses that word more than anybody. So
and we saw that right at the very beginning when in the first typical day of Jesus' ministry, it's a ministry of power, and the power to release people from the grip that Satan has on their lives.
Yeah.
The other thing which I love noticing, I don't know if I'm just a bit obsessed about this, James. Am I unusual? I don't know, but the answer probably is yes to both of those. That in terms of style, yet again here it's really noticeable that Mark's account is full of parataxis.
Yes.
That is, he says, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Whereas Matthew, to some extent, and Luke much more so, will use hypertaxis, where he says, this having happened, then so and so, and because of that, then the other. So you get the arrangement of the grammar in a sort of structure, whereas Mark is just this sort of breathless account, one thing after the other.
Yes, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? Parataxis is the way young children tell stories. And when they're telling a story of what's happened that day to their mother or their father or something. And it's an excitement because for them it's all one thing, isn't it? It's all together. And it's not a sort of narrative that is really particularly played out, through time. It's just trying to get it all out there.
Now, getting into the detail of the passage, this is something that I've commented on when I've written about this, and I think it's something distinctive that I'm observing here. I don't think I've come across this in commentaries. I may be wrong. You may want to comment about this. This account is about the transfiguration of Jesus, and then Mark goes straight into it, verse 2. After 6 days, so 6 days after this event. Oh, by the way, I think it's Luke says after 8 days, but I mean that's just depending on whether you count inclusively or exclusively the days. So they went up a high mountain, they were alone, and he was transfigured before them. And I think we often treat the transfiguration as Jesus being changed. Whereas I think I would want to argue that actually when you look at what's happening here, it's not so much Jesus being changed, but it's the disciples' perception being changed in the sense that Jesus is the same person he was, but what's happened is that they've had a clearer revelation of who he is. I don't know if that's convincing.
Well, I think it's very interesting, isn't it? That if you look at the parallels in Matthew and Luke, the language which is used to describe the transfigured Jesus, it varies between them, and the emphasis that they place. Matthew and Luke, I think, emphasize that Jesus' face, and Mark emphasizes the transformation of his clothing. And Mark uses two hapax legomenon, which we've mentioned before, words which are only used once in the New Testament.
Yes, hapax meaning once, and legomenon meaning something that's said. Yes, something said only once.
Something said. And he uses two words within his description of how Jesus was transfigured, which are hapax legomenon. So there's a very interesting variation there. And that rather argues, I think, in favor of your theory, that it's about because if they're drawing on different eyewitnesses, and it seems that Mark might be drawing on Peter's account, then you're going to get that because it's gone, it's how they saw it personally, rather than particularly, how they're, it's an overwhelming experience. So it's kind of So I think that probably argues for your because of course this what we're really seeing and what the passage is about is telling us this is really who Jesus is. This is what all we're seeing is we're seeing the truth about him.
Yes.
So the veil is drawn back, as it were, for a moment, isn't it?
And again, there's an interesting dynamic here in terms of the direction of travel, which is that on the one hand, I think particularly in Mark's account, you've got looking back towards Old Testament ideas, and particularly Moses on Mount Sinai and his encounter with God. But then you also got looking forward to later parts of the New Testament. So you've got where's the reference? 2 Peter, I want to say.
Yes, it is 2 Peter. Yeah.
You've got another we're not going to get into an argument about who wrote 2 Peter. That's for another
No.
we'll do that. But you've got specific reference to this. But of course, the other thing is, well, you know what I'm going to say next, don't you? It's Revelation chapter 1.
Of course it is. Yeah.
And again, one of the
Yeah.
sort of, as it were, conclusions in critical scholarship is that whoever wrote Revelation chapter 1 has no idea of the earthly Jesus. But of course, actually, in the Transfiguration, you have a very, very similar kind of description.
Yeah.
Which also focuses on his clothes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
we ought to just have a look at some of the Old Testament antecedents, because there's some interesting parallels, but also contrasts, aren't there?
There are.
His encounter with God. I'm really looking at Exodus 24, I think.
Yes, where of course Moses goes up the mountain, and he has this experience that when he's with God, as it were, and when he comes down, his face is shining, and they can't cope with it, and he has to have it covered up.
Yeah,
the veil has to be, and so in a sense, this is a parallel in that Jesus, like the new Moses, goes up the mountain,
yes,
and he takes companions with him, but as as we discover, this transfigurement is actually his own transfigurement. It's not the reflection of the divine glory; it is the divine glory.
Yes.
Yeah,
and that's why, of course, Paul makes the comparison in 2 Corinthians, doesn't he? Say, "We with unveiled faces see the glory of the Lord."
Yeah,
and of course, the classic contrast is that for Moses, the glory then fades.
Yeah,
because the impact isn't lasting. Whereas actually with Jesus, it won't fade, because it's a reflection of who he actually is.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a hint of that in terms of it, kind of. I mean, that's true sort of theologically, isn't it? But it is also kind of hint that it lingers, isn't there? In verse 15, which is beyond the passage that we read, where the crowd were immediately overcome with awe when Jesus come down the mountain. They see him. There's no obvious reason for them to be overcome with awe, other than you think maybe they're glimpsing something that the disciples saw. Maybe they're seeing the sort of after effect.
Yes, and that's unique to Mark as well.
Yeah.
That is really fascinating, isn't it? I have a joke about awe.
Oh, go on. Just get it out of the way. Let's put us through the pain.
Is John Wayne in The Greatest Story Ever Told, and he's a centurion of the cross, and he says, "Or truly, this is." So he says, "Truly, this was the Son of God," and the director cuts it and says, "No, come on, John, we want more awe." So then he goes, "Okay, action," and John Wayne says, "Or truly, this was the Son of God."
Exactly.
It's a terrible joke, I know.
It is absolutely a terrible joke. Yes, we could really have done without it.
Sorry about that. We'll cut it out in the edit, eh?
Yeah, the edit. That's right. Yeah.
Now, just again, looking at sort of some of the Old Testament allusions here, and again, it's really interesting, isn't it, that Mark, even though his account is the shortest, he is really dense with sort of Old Testament allusions here. With him, and again, very brief reference in Mark, with him appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Now, again, in Luke, they're talking about with Jesus, and Luke says just uniquely, another hapax legomenon in Luke, about the exodus he was going to perform in Jerusalem. So again, Luke has a distinctive focus on the city of Jerusalem. That's one of his real concerns and themes, even though he's writing for a more Gentile audience. So Luke is very clear that the more Gentile he gets, the more Jewish he has to make sure people realize Jesus is, which is interesting itself, isn't it?
Yes.
But here, very, very, and people often have a very, it's interesting how they have a particular interpretation of why you've got Elijah and Moses with Jesus and what they represent, haven't they?
Yes, often they're said to represent the law and the prophets, and in art of this incident, Moses is often holding up an impossibly heavy tablet or 2 tablets of stone.
Huge tablets of stone.
Yeah, and he obviously saw Mr. Muscle Man. In a sense, sort of, the artist is telling us this is how you interpret this thing. But I think, as we think about Elijah as the prophets, well, you wouldn't expect Elijah to be chosen as the prophet.
No.
He didn't write anything down. I mean, he's not Isaiah, he's not Daniel, he's not Ezekiel.
No, Isaiah would have been a better choice, wouldn't he?
Exactly. And I mean, and Jesus draws heavily on Isaiah and Daniel for his own understanding of himself and his vocation. So it seems like slightly odd choice. But then if you start thinking a bit in a slightly different way about it, I mean, Moses represents the journey through suffering in the wilderness and to freedom in the promised land. And Elijah is famous for his call to faithfulness, and that makes much more of a connection with what Jesus said just before this story about turning his face towards the suffering of the cross and his future vindication. So I think there's something there. I think that, but there's also something as well about them. I think the phrase is being the deathless ones, isn't there, Ian?
Yes, exactly. So in both of those, in Jewish literature in the first century, were talked about as being the deathless ones, because of course Elijah goes up in the chariot of fire, and therefore so doesn't suffer death. And of course in the account at the end of Deuteronomy, there's something very strange about Moses, where it says that Moses died and was buried, but no one knows where he was buried. And again, Jewish tradition is that his body was taken by angels. And so yes, I think again, now this is a kind of implicit nod towards what Luke makes explicit in terms of the mention of Jesus' Exodus, because it is precisely, it's Jesus. Well, again, the allusion, as you said, to Moses taken through the promised land, and also just on Elijah as well. It's worth noticing that Elijah is the prophet par excellence who suffers at the hands of the rulers of the day. So and after the Mount Carmel episode, he's filled with despair and thinking he's the only one, and you have the episode on the mountain where earth, wind, and fire and all that. And so both of them actually embody enduring suffering on the journey and keeping faith. But I think this thing about being the two deathless ones is really key. So Jesus is showing, and interesting, just again in the introduction to Dine 1, he says there are some here who will not taste death until they see this. And of course, Jesus is the one himself who will taste death for them and will triumph over death. So you've actually got that theme coming all the way through the passage as well.
You have, and I wonder also here with we're talking about Elijah as the one who suffers at the hands of and is there in suffering. You've also got Peter, James, and John, who are with Jesus. Well, the times when they're with Jesus are very interesting in Mark, and one of the times, of course, is in the Garden of Gethsemane. So there's that theme seems to be kind of quite emphasised here, even in the place of transfiguration and glory.
And Peter says, even if anyone deserts, I will die with you. And then we get on to this very strange reaction, don't they? And again, the other that Matthew and Luke fill us out a bit more. I mean, Mark is quite compressed here, but he says, let us put up three. Well, now, interesting here. 3 shelters, says the NIV. 3 tents, says the ESV. And little connection here, which I don't think I've mentioned when I've written about this before. But of course, the language of the 3 tents is the word he uses is a skena. Which is the verb skenoo, which it's used for words tent, but it's also particularly used in the Old Testament for the tabernacle. And of course, in John 1, the word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. And it shows this failure to understand. I mean, they're overwhelmed, they're terrified, not surprisingly, but also the disciples are still just haven't grasped exactly who Jesus is and the significance of his ministry. And here's the irony: let's make some tents for you, which in a sense the Gospels are saying Jesus is already tented, tabernacled with us.
He is the tent.
That's what the incarnation is all about. It's about him tabernacling with us. So there's a really interesting connection there across to John chapter 1.
Yeah, and it feels like Peter's interjection is a sort of kind of classic spontaneous Peter, isn't it? Even if Mark lets him off the hook in the next verse by saying, well, they were terrified and it was all a bit difficult. But nevertheless, his character, it's so consistent with the character of Peter, this instance, that he should be the one who says that.
And just again, little apologetic point. I mean, if you were the disciples and you were making this stuff up, I mean, honestly, if I was making this up, I would make myself look an awful lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite. Make sure you gave yourself a much better press than this. It would all be about the privilege of being on the holy mountain with him, wouldn't it? And gosh, amazing what we saw, but it doesn't come across like that at all.
Yeah, and therefore you must listen to me because I was with Jesus and I got it right. So but there's a lesson there somewhere, isn't there? And then a cloud appeared and covered them. And again, it just made me laugh reading about clouds in the New Testament, because now friends in America, depending on where you live, might be very different for you, but here in the UK we see a lot of clouds all the time. Clouds signify nothing. Clouds mean you're in England because it's going to rain, bound to rain sometime in the day. But of course, in this context here, every time a cloud appears, we need to sit and take notice, don't we?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you're thinking of Noah, aren't you? And and that story with the cloud that grows in it's such an unusual thing. It's
It is,
amazing.
it is, it is. And in Elijah's ministry in the cloud as small as a
Yeah.
man's hand, but also in the Psalms, God rides on the clouds.
Clouds.
And of course, the ascension, Jesus is taken up into a cloud and he'll appear in the same way. And Paul talks about coming on the clouds. So clouds signify the presence and power of God himself.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then a voice comes out of the cloud, again in Mark reiterating the baptism. This is my beloved son. Listen to him.
Yeah. Listen to him. Which
Um,
is interesting in itself, because Jesus in this particular instance we don't have any recorded words of Jesus. We know he's been talking to Moses and Elijah, but he hasn't said anything to the disciples directly. But yeah, absolutely listen to him, which must have been absolutely terrifying from that. I mean, because it comes across, doesn't it, as a sort of rebuke almost.
We can't delve into it now, but again, once more, it just sort of raises this question about how we relate to God, how we picture that, how we envisage our relationship with Jesus, because there's a sense in which I think, particularly in evangelical piety, there's God is kind of distant, but Jesus is kind of friendly and has come close to us. And yet, of course, here are the people who've lived with him who, at this moment of encounter with Jesus in the flesh, are absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
I had a little debate with a friend a few years ago, and he said, "Oh, well, no, Jesus is our celestial chum. We should never be afraid of Jesus, or never, we should never be overcome or because Jesus is our pal." I kind of, well, you know what? The disciples didn't always feel that.
No, they didn't.
They found Jesus sometimes terrifying, sometimes baffling, sometimes elusive. Yeah. And suddenly, verse 8, although actually not the normal word for suddenly, a different word here.
Different word for, and once again, a unique word, another hapax-legomenon, and a word which really means unexpectedly, I think. So there's which is ex opino, I think, and so they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. So
and also the emphasis here, suddenly looking around, periplepsamene. So they're kind of going, what's happened? What's happening here? What's gone on? And it is again as another word indicating their sort of struggle to get their heads around it. So and just the last thing within our passage, because it's only these 9 verses. Again, you get this thing which has been argued to be the messianic secret. When they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they'd seen until there's that phrase again, Son of Man, risen from the dead. And again, I should remember the 19th century scholar who said this. Can you remember the messianic secret? Was it Vreda? Vreda.
I don't remember actually. I didn't.
James, think back to your undergraduate theology.
Yes, I know. I'm entirely familiar with the concept, but not with the originator.
I'm sure it was Vreda. Well, anyway, someone can make a comment if we're wrong.
Yeah, they'll.
Who is arguing that the reason why in Mark's gospel we find this idea of the messianic secret, Jesus keeps saying, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone, is that in Jesus' lifetime, nobody thought of him as Messiah. And then when the disciples later, the early church later, projected this back on the account of Jesus, then they included this little device here to account for the oddity of not thinking Jesus was Messiah and now thinking he was Messiah. But a much simpler explanation is that's what Jesus told them.
Yes. And there could well have been very good reasons for that.
Yeah.
Not least political.
Not least the misunderstanding.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Yeah.
And you get this extraordinary contrast as we began, actually, didn't we? The extraordinary contrast with Jesus predicting his own suffering and death on the one hand, and the revelation of who he really was on the other in the Transfiguration, which again is constantly trying to get them to have their own understanding transformed.
Yes.
Well, maybe just a little summary paragraph here I've got on my article, and this might be a good point to finish. In any relationship, it takes time to understand and to get to know someone, even with people we know quite well. There are times when we gain particular insight into their character by something they do or they say, which gives us a fresh insight into who they are. This seems to be how the Transfiguration functions for the three disciples and offers a key insight into who Jesus is. Is it an insight that we've yet gained for ourselves? James, great to chat with you about this. Friends, lovely to have you join us. I hope you found that useful. And James, just a reminder, what are the 4 things people need to do?
So do like the videos, do subscribe to the channel, do share on the social media, and do comment.
We do. And if you want to ask a bit more about Vrede and the Messianic Secret or anything we've talked about, then do make a comment and we'd love to engage with you. So thanks so much, James. See you again next time. Friends,
Yes, indeed.
look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.